My name is Nina, and at 33 years old, I watched my parents realize I had completely destroyed their financial future. We were sitting around a sterile mahogany conference table in downtown Chicago. It was the afternoon of my departure, 6 hours before I was scheduled to board a one-way flight to London for a multi-year contract. My father, Howard, sat at the head of the table. He folded his hands, looked me right in the eye, and told me that we needed to restructure my entire life savings for my own good. Beside him, their shady family lawyer was already typing my personal bank account numbers into a wire transfer portal. My mother Barbara sat quietly, offering me a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. My older brother Connor was literally rubbing his hands together in anticipation. I just sat there and said absolutely nothing. I watched the loading wheel spin on the large projection screen at the front of the room. The lawyer hit enter. The system processed the request, then the screen refreshed to show the balances. Every meaningful account had been drained. The combined domestic balance was only $42.16. The lawyer stammered, his fingers trembling as he turned the screen toward my father. Howard froze, the blood entirely draining from his face. Barbara let out a sharp gasp and slumped backward, fainting, right there in her designer chair. If you have ever had to build a fortress to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to protect you, you will want to hear exactly how I turned my father's ultimate trap into his absolute ruin. I work as a forensic corporate restructuring consultant. It is a fancy title for someone who gets hired to audit failing companies, hunt down hidden assets, and dismantle complex financial fraud. I fix disasters for a living. I track every penny, uncover every lie, and liquidate toxic assets without an ounce of hesitation. But the greatest disaster I ever had to audit and liquidate was my own family's profound entitlement. Growing up, the dynamic in our house was perfectly clear. Howard was the manipulative patriarch who controlled everything with an iron grip and a conditional wallet. Barbara was the enabler, a woman who weaponized guilt to keep the peace and ensure we all followed my father's script. And then there was Connor. At 35, Connor was the undisputed golden child of the family. He called himself an entrepreneur, but in reality, he was a chronically failing businessman whose constant disasters were always subsidized by my hard work and achievements. While I earned scholarships and worked graveyard shifts to pay for my degrees, Connor was given seed money for startups that vanished within months. The family operated on a simple rule. Connor takes risks, and Nina pays for the consequences. But they vastly underestimated what happens when you try to con a professional auditor. The chain of events that led to that empty bank account began exactly 2 weeks before my flight to London. My parents had insisted on hosting a family dinner at their sprawling suburban estate. They framed it as an early farewell party for me, but the tension in the dining room suggested otherwise. The long oak table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, a display of wealth my parents loved to project. I sat quietly eating my roasted vegetables, waiting for the inevitable shoe to drop. It did not take long. Over the appetizers, Connor began pacing the room, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. He cleared his throat and announced that his luxury real estate startup was facing a massive margin call. He needed $2.5 million by Tuesday, or his entire company would go under. I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the familiar weight of their expectations settling over the room. Howard did not look at Connor. Instead, he turned his sharp, calculating gaze directly on me. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick legal document, and slid it across the table, pushing aside my dinner plate. He told me that my late Aunt Helen had left me a $4 million estate, and it was time for me to step up. He demanded that I liquidate my inheritance immediately to cover Connor's minor cash flow hiccup. I stared at the paperwork, then looked back at my father. I calmly pushed the document away and told him no. I told him I was not giving up my future to pay off Connor's bad investments. The dining room exploded into chaos. Connor slammed his hands on the table, knocking over a wine glass. He sneered at me, calling me a glorified bean counter who did not understand the basic risks of real wealth creation. He said I was hoarding money I did not even know how to use, while his visionary business was on the brink of collapse. Then Barbara chimed in, weaponizing the past, just as she always did. Tears welled up in her eyes as she clutched her napkin. She accused me of being terribly selfish, crying about how the family had sacrificed everything to put me through college and ensure my success. I did not back down. I looked right at her and reminded everyone at the table that I paid my own tuition. I reminded them about the graveyard shifts I worked at a diner while they bought Connor a brand new Mercedes that he crashed into a tree just a month later. The room grew deathly quiet. Howard slowly picked up his glass of scotch, took a sip, and offered me a cold, chilling smirk. He leaned forward, tapping the legal document with his index finger. He casually mentioned that as the appointed financial advisor on my aunt's original trust, he had certain privileges. He told me he had the legal right to execute emergency wealth preservation transfers. He said he could move the money with or without my enthusiastic consent. That was the moment I realized my family was not just asking for a favor. They were declaring war. The silence that followed my father's threat hung in the dining room like a heavy winter fog. The clinking of silverware had stopped entirely. Connor leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair, swirling his red wine with a deeply satisfied smirk. He looked exactly like a man who had just won a high-stakes poker game without ever having to show his hand. He took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on me, silently daring me to challenge the absolute authority of the family patriarch. My mother nervously adjusted her linen napkin in her lap, her eyes darting between my father and me. She let out a breathy and entirely artificial laugh, the exact sound she always used to paper over the ugly truths that governed our household. She reached across the table, offering a weak smile, as if we were discussing a minor disagreement over holiday plans, rather than the hostile takeover of my entire future. She told me that Howard was only looking out for the family legacy, and that I should be grateful. I stared at the three of them, feeling a cold knot of absolute clarity forming in my stomach. For 33 years, I had analyzed corporate fraud. I had sat in boardrooms with corrupt executives and watched them try to justify stealing millions from their own employees. I knew the look of desperate greed perfectly. And right now, I was seeing that exact same predatory hunger in the eyes of my own father and brother. I did not yell. I did not throw my glass or make a dramatic scene. Emotional outbursts were exactly what they expected from me, and my father would only use a reaction as proof that I was too unstable to manage my own wealth. Instead, I carefully placed my folded napkin on the table. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a slow and deliberate movement that made Connor flinch slightly. I looked directly at Howard. I told him that my aunt left that money to me, not to his golden child, and that I would rather burn every last dollar than let him use it to subsidize another one of Connor's catastrophic failures. Howard did not blink. His expression remained carved from stone, radiating an arrogant certainty that he already held all the winning cards. He simply told me to drive home safely and think very carefully about my next move. I turned and walked out of the formal dining room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors of their suburban mansion. I could hear the immediate hushed whispering starting behind me, but I did not stop. I reached the grand foyer and retrieved my coat from the closet. Just as I was putting it on, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. Connor had followed me out. He stood in the arched doorway of the hall, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over his chest. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure disdain. He told me I was being incredibly stupid and stubborn. He boasted that his luxury real estate startup was on the verge of revolutionizing the entire market, and that the $2.5 million he needed was just a temporary bridge loan. I finished buttoning my coat and turned to face my brother. I looked at his designer suit, his expensive watch, and the arrogant tilt of his chin. I asked him a very simple question. If his real estate startup was truly revolutionizing the market, why were his institutional investors calling in their margins and threatening to liquidate his assets by Tuesday? I watched the smugness vanish from his face, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. He demanded to know how I knew about the institutional investors. I simply smiled, stepped closer to him, and told him that unlike him, I actually understood how to read a balance sheet. I told him his company was bleeding cash, and I was not going to be the bandage that covered his incompetence. Connor turned bright red, stepping forward, aggressively pointing a finger directly at my face. He told me I had no idea what was coming, and that Dad was going to take control of the accounts by the morning, whether I liked it or not. Before the argument could escalate any further, my mother scurried into the foyer, physically stepping between us. She placed her hands gently on my shoulders, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. She played her favorite role perfectly, the devastated matriarch just trying to keep her family together. She begged me to listen to reason. She told me that family means sacrifice, and that if I let Connor's business fail, I would be responsible for ruining his life and destroying his marriage to Whitney. She reminded me of all the times they had supported me, conveniently ignoring the fact that their support had always been conditional and weaponized. I gently but firmly removed her hands from my shoulders. I told her that shielding a grown man from the consequences of his own terrible decisions was not love. It was enablement. I told her I would not set myself on fire just to keep her favorite son warm. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing November night. The cold air hit my face, shocking my system and clearing the lingering fog of family manipulation. I walked down the long, winding driveway to my car, got inside, and locked the doors. For a long time, I just sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as the reality of the evening washed over me. My father was not a man who made empty threats. If Howard said he had the legal right to execute emergency wealth preservation transfers, he believed he had found a loophole to bypass my authorization entirely. I started the engine and began the 45-minute drive back to my apartment in the city. The highway was mostly empty, allowing my mind to race through the potential legal mechanisms my father might be trying to exploit. My Aunt Helen had passed away when I was 22 years old. At the time, I was young, grieving, and entirely overwhelmed by the prospect of managing a $4 million estate. My father had stepped in, playing the role of the protective parent. He advised me to place the assets into a domestic trust structure and offered to act as the appointed financial advisor to help me navigate complex tax implications. Because he was my father, and because I had not yet learned the harsh realities of corporate greed, I signed the paperwork. I gave him advisory privileges, assuming those privileges were limited to monitoring and suggesting investments. I never removed him from the accounts because I spent the last decade building my own career, completely financially independent, leaving the inherited trust untouched to grow in the background. It never crossed my mind that my own father would attempt to use a decade-old advisory status to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my assets. I arrived at my apartment building, parked in the underground garage, and took the elevator up to my floor. My apartment was quiet and dark, a sharp contrast to the chaotic battlefield I had just left. I walked straight to my home office, turned on the bright overhead lights, and dropped my keys on the desk. I did not bother changing out of my clothes. The emotional daughter who had just been betrayed by her family was gone. In her place was the forensic corporate restructuring consultant, the woman who disassembled financial fraud for a living. I opened my laptop and pulled up the digital archives of my personal financial records. I needed to understand exactly what kind of access Howard possessed and how quickly he could mobilize. As I reviewed the original trust documents from over a decade ago, a sickening realization began to form. The legal jargon on the screen blurred for a moment before snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. Paragraph 4, subsection B of the advisory agreement I had signed at 22 contained a single, highly specific clause hidden beneath layers of dense financial terminology. It outlined the parameters for what the document called emergency wealth preservation transfers. Those were the exact words my father had used just hours earlier. I sat back in my desk chair, the cold glow of the laptop monitor illuminating the dark room, as the full weight of his calculated betrayal crashed over me. He had not just made an empty threat at the dinner table. He was quoting the exact legal mechanism he had secretly embedded in my trust over a decade ago. The memory of his smug expression flooded my mind, reigniting the fury I had felt when he abruptly stopped the argument. Took a slow sip of his scotch, and casually mentioned his absolute legal authority to move my money with or without my enthusiastic consent. He had known this day might come. He had built a trapdoor into my financial foundation while I was still mourning the loss of the aunt who had actually loved me. The language in the advisory agreement forced me to revisit a part of Aunt Helen's estate plan I had never examined with professional distance. Helen had not trusted Howard with ownership of the money. She had named me the sole beneficiary and granted him only a temporary advisory role because I was 22, grieving, and still finishing school. In a letter attached to the original file, she wrote that the inheritance was meant to give me choices no one else in the family had ever protected. She wanted the principle preserved until I was established enough to decide what kind of life I wanted. Howard had always described his role as proof that Helen trusted his judgment. The document said something very different. His authority was narrow, conditional, and tied to the stated purpose of protecting me. I opened the archived account history and began tracing every administrative change made since Helen's death. Most were harmless portfolio adjustments, but a pattern emerged in the metadata. Howard had repeatedly requested broader access whenever Connor launched a new venture. Years earlier, he had asked the bank whether the trust could guarantee a restaurant lease. Later, he had inquired about using inherited property as collateral for Connor's failed technology fund. Each request had been rejected because I had not consented. None of those attempts had ever been disclosed to me. The emergency clause now looked less like an accidental loophole and more like the final tool Howard had saved for the moment ordinary pressure stopped working. It permitted temporary movement of assets only when a genuine threat endangered the beneficiary's estate. Connor's margin call did not qualify. Howard would have to misrepresent the transaction, invent a threat to my financial security, and persuade the bank that immediate action was necessary before I could object. That meant he could not be acting alone. He needed legal documents, a compliant lender, and someone willing to certify that I had approved a transfer I had explicitly refused. I exported the agreement, the advisory history, and every access log into a protected case folder. Then I created a timeline beginning with Aunt Helen's death and ending with Howard's threat at dinner. For the first time, I could see the scheme as a restructuring problem rather than a family argument. The trust was the vulnerable entity. Howard's advisory status was the unauthorized access point. Connor's company was the toxic liability they intended to force onto my balance sheet. Before I could protect the estate, I needed to identify every person helping them turn that liability into my obligation. I looked back at the laptop screen, scrolling through the dense pages of the trust agreement. The Emergency Wealth Preservation Clause was designed to allow the appointed advisor to shift assets into protective holding accounts in the event of extreme market volatility or a sudden threat to the beneficiary. My father was planning to twist that language, defining Connor's margin call as an emergency that somehow threatened the family ecosystem, thereby justifying the transfer of my funds to a shared holding company under his control. It was a staggering abuse of fiduciary duty, but it was legally ambiguous enough that a fast-moving bank might just process the wire transfer before I could untangle the mess. My father knew that corporate litigation could take years, and by the time I managed to freeze the accounts or get a judge to intervene, the money would already be gone, swallowed up by Connor's creditors. Howard was banking on the fact that I was leaving for London in a few days. He assumed I would be too busy packing, coordinating international logistics, and saying goodbyes to closely monitor the domestic trust. He expected me to board that international flight entirely oblivious to the massive financial theft happening right under my very nose. He honestly thought that I would land in a foreign country, log into my investment portfolio, and suddenly find myself completely emptied out, thousands of miles away, and powerless to stop him. The sheer calculation behind the timing of his ambush made my blood run freezing cold. He had not asked for the money because he thought I would actually say yes. He had asked for the money to create a documented instance of family distress, setting the perfect stage to trigger his emergency clause when I inevitably refused. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a strategy so cold and utterly ruthless that I actually felt a brief, terrifying wave of respect for his audacity. But Howard had made one fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten who I was and what I did for a living. Every single day, I do not panic when the numbers look bad. I do not crumble when hostile entities attempt a hostile takeover. I dismantle them. I pulled up my secure email client and began drafting an urgent message to my private wealth manager at the bank. I needed an in-person meeting the moment the doors opened the following morning. I requested a full review of all recent account inquiries and a complete lockdown on outbound wire transfers. The pain of my family betraying me was still a raw, bleeding wound in my chest, but the grief would have to wait. Right now, I had a war to win, and I was going to use every weapon in my professional arsenal to make sure they lost everything. I did not sleep a single minute that night. Instead, I drank 3 cups of black coffee and meticulously outlined my defensive strategy. By the time the sun began to rise over the city skyline, I was already dressed in my sharpest navy blue suit, the exact armor I wore when dismantling corrupt corporate executives. I drove to the downtown branch of my private wealth management firm in absolute silence. The city was just waking up, the streets mostly empty, but my mind had been racing at full speed for hours. The bank building was a towering structure of glass and steel, an imposing fortress of financial security that stood in stark contrast to the emotional wreckage of my childhood home. I walked through the heavy revolving doors exactly 5 minutes before the branch officially opened to the public. The security guard recognized me from my previous visits and gave a polite nod, allowing me to bypass the main floor. I proceeded directly to the executive suite elevators. My private wealth manager, Harrison, was already waiting for me in the polished marble lobby of the 7th floor. I had worked with Harrison for 6 years. He was a meticulous, by-the-book financial professional who managed the quiet, steady growth of my aunt's trust while I focused entirely on building my own career. He knew me as a conservative, low-risk client who checked in quarterly to review standard index funds. He did not know the cold, calculating woman walking toward him this morning. Harrison looked deeply concerned as I approached. My late-night email demanding an immediate total account lockdown was entirely out of character for our working relationship. He greeted me with a firm handshake, but wisely skipped the usual pleasantries about the weather or my upcoming trip abroad. He guided me past his standard glass-walled office and escorted me directly into one of the windowless, soundproof conference rooms reserved for highly sensitive client matters. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, sealing us in absolute quiet. Harrison gestured to a plush leather chair and offered me a glass of water, which I declined. I sat down, placed my briefcase on the table, and looked him straight in the eye. I told him I needed to know exactly what kind of activity had been occurring on my domestic trust accounts over the past 72 hours. I instructed him to ignore any existing advisory privileges my father held and speak to me directly as the sole ultimate beneficiary of the estate. Harrison took a deep breath, opened his secure tablet, and removed his reading glasses. He looked at me with an expression that mixed professional discretion with genuine, undeniable alarm. He leaned forward and told me that he was incredibly relieved I had requested this meeting. He confessed that he had been planning to contact me himself later that morning, but strict banking protocols regarding appointed advisors had tied his hands until a formal transaction was fully initiated. Harrison slid the illuminated tablet across the smooth mahogany table. He explained that my father had not just been passively monitoring the accounts. Over the last 48 hours, Howard had made 3 separate, highly aggressive attempts to leverage the entirety of my inherited estate. My father was not trying to move the money into a protective holding account, as the Emergency Wealth Preservation Clause suggested. Instead, Howard was attempting to pledge my $4 million trust as direct collateral for a massive, high-risk commercial loan. I stared at the screen, reading the names listed on the preliminary loan application. The primary debtor listed on the paperwork was a luxury real estate holding company. I instantly recognized the corporate entity as the exact same failing venture Connor had been bragging about during the dinner service. My father was systematically trying to mortgage my entire future to secure a $2.5 million lifeline from my brother. Harrison carefully explained the mechanical process of the attempted transaction. Because Howard was listed as a trusted financial advisor on the account, he had the necessary administrative clearance to request the initial loan underwriting process. According to the internal bank logs, my father had spent the last 2 days aggressively pressuring the commercial lending division to expedite the approval. He had explicitly told the loan officers that I was fully aware of the transaction and that I was completely on board with supporting my family business. Howard had spun a masterful lie, claiming that I was simply too busy preparing for my complex relocation to London to handle the tedious administrative paperwork myself. He used my upcoming international move as the perfect alibi to rush a multi-million-dollar collateral pledge through the banking system before I could catch wind of his scheme. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as the sheer scale of his audacity washed over me. I looked up from the tablet and asked Harrison how my father could possibly finalize a collateral guarantee of that magnitude without my direct, verified, and notarized consent. The bank had strict security measures in place for a reason. Harrison looked down at his hands, his expression growing even more grim. He reached into a thick manila folder resting next to his tablet. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it gently on the table in front of me. He explained that the commercial lending department absolutely required a preliminary authorization form signed by the primary account holder to move the underwriting process to the final binding stage. Harrison told me that Howard had hand-delivered this physical document to the bank yesterday afternoon. My father had stood in the lobby, looked a bank officer in the eye, and claimed he had just come from a lovely farewell lunch with his daughter, where I had gladly signed the paperwork to help my brother out of a temporary bind. I looked down at the preliminary collateral guarantee resting on the table. The legal language was dense, binding my entire net worth to Connor's sinking ship without any hesitation. At the very bottom of the page, resting perfectly on the designated signature line, was my name. I stared at the dark blue ink, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. It was not a sloppy imitation. It was not a rushed scrawl that kind of looked like my everyday handwriting. It was a perfect, flawless, and undeniable forgery of my exact signature. My father and my brother had officially crossed the line from toxic family dynamics straight into federal financial crimes. They had forged my name on a bank document to steal my inheritance, firmly believing I would be too far away to ever hold them accountable for their actions. I picked up the forged document, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room. The loops and angles of the letters were chillingly accurate. My own father had meticulously practiced writing my name just so he could rob me blind and hand the proceeds over to his favorite child. A dark, quiet anger settled deep into my bones, completely replacing any lingering sense of familial loyalty I might have had left. I placed the forged paper back onto the table, my hand perfectly steady. I looked up at Harrison, who was watching me with silent concern, and I told him exactly what we were going to do next. I instructed Harrison to freeze every single account tied to my trust. I told him to reject the preliminary collateral guarantee entirely, citing a minor discrepancy in the signature verification process, but to do so quietly. I needed my father to believe his paperwork was just caught up in standard banking bureaucracy, not actively blocked by me. Harrison nodded, his professional demeanor returning as he locked down my portfolio with a few keystrokes. I thanked him, picked up my briefcase, and walked out of the bank. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of calculated anger. Howard and Connor had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. By the time I unlocked my front door, I was no longer operating as a betrayed daughter. I was a forensic corporate restructuring consultant, and my own family had just become my primary target. I walked straight into my home office, locked the door behind me, and booted up my encrypted workstation. I pulled up my specialized financial auditing software. It was time to find out exactly why my brother was willing to commit a federal crime for $2.5 million. People do not risk prison over a minor cash flow hiccup. They risk prison when they are already drowning. I tapped into my network of industry connections, accessing restricted commercial databases, public court filings, and corporate registration ledgers. I immediately started by pulling every shred of data I could find on Connor's luxury real estate holding company. The digital paper trail was a masterclass in financial incompetence. As I parsed through the limited liability company registrations and property deeds, the facade of my brother's brilliant entrepreneurial career completely dissolved. Connor was not a visionary real estate developer. He was a man playing a very dangerous game of musical chairs with other people's money. He had structured his business using a complex web of shell companies, each designed to obscure the staggering amount of debt he was actually carrying. I cross-referenced his property acquisitions with his commercial loan agreements and found massive discrepancies. He had been intentionally overvaluing underdeveloped properties to secure larger loans from secondary lenders who did not ask too many questions. But the real estate market had recently cooled, and those secondary lenders were suddenly demanding proof of liquidity. Connor had nothing to show them. He had burned through his initial seed capital in less than 6 months, spending investor money on extravagant marketing campaigns, leased luxury vehicles to maintain his image, and a ridiculous downtown office space he could not afford. The balance sheets I managed to construct from public tax filings painted a picture of absolute devastation. His operating accounts were practically empty. The $2.5 million he demanded at the dinner table was not a bridge loan to secure a new revolutionary project. It was the exact amount he needed to satisfy a specific group of angry institutional investors who were threatening to seize everything. The ugly truth went much deeper than simple mismanagement. I dug into pending civil litigation dockets across 3 different counties and hit the absolute jackpot. Connor was actively facing 4 separate undisclosed lawsuits from his early-stage investors. They were accusing him of commingling funds, breaching fiduciary duties, and engaging in deliberate financial misrepresentation. My brother was not just running a failing business. He was operating a borderline Ponzi scheme. He had been using the capital from his newest investors to pay off the guaranteed returns he had promised his earliest backers. It was a classic, desperate move, and it meant that his entire corporate structure was a house of cards, waiting for a strong breeze. If those lawsuits went to discovery, the courts would easily pierce his corporate veil, holding him personally liable for the missing millions. He would lose his house, his cars, and whatever dignity he had left. More importantly, to my father, the scandal would utterly destroy the family's pristine social reputation. Howard's legacy would be permanently tainted by a son going to federal prison for defrauding investors. That was why my father was willing to forge my signature. He was not just trying to save Connor's business. He was trying to buy enough time to settle the lawsuits out of court and bury the criminal evidence before the authorities got involved. My $4 million inheritance was the only clean, untraceable cash they could access quickly enough to plug the sinking ship. But the collateral guarantee I had seen at the bank was only the first phase of their attack. As I continued my forensic sweep, tracking the registered agents attached to Connor's various shell companies, a familiar name kept popping up in the digital records. Arthur Caldwell. He was a notoriously shady family lawyer who had handled my parents' estate planning for years. Caldwell was known in legal circles for his willingness to bend the rules for wealthy clients who needed problems to quietly disappear. I ran a targeted search on recent filings associated with his law firm and my family's names. What I found made the blood freeze in my veins. Caldwell had recently petitioned the local probate court to update the advisory records on my aunt's original trust. Attached to that public petition was a draft document outlining a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney. They were not just trying to use my money as collateral for a loan. They were systematically laying the legal groundwork to grant Howard absolute, unchecked control over every single asset I owned. The power of attorney document was dangerously broad, granting my father the right to liquidate assets, close bank accounts, and transfer funds internationally without requiring any secondary approval from me. It was a complete financial hijacking disguised as standard estate maintenance. And according to the digital timestamps on the court filings, Caldwell had started drafting this document a full week before the family dinner had even taken place. The true depth of their malice clicked into place as I stared at the dates. My father had orchestrated the entire confrontation at the dinner table, knowing he was already building a back door to drain my accounts. The forged collateral guarantee was just a temporary stopgap, a desperate measure to keep Connor's investors at bay for a few more days while Caldwell finalized the power of attorney. They had meticulously timed this entire operation around my professional schedule. They knew I was flying to London to begin a demanding multi-year corporate restructuring contract. They knew I would be distracted by international logistics, jet lag, and establishing a new life across the ocean. Their plan was as brilliant as it was evil. They intended to execute the backdated power of attorney and drain my domestic accounts the exact moment my plane took off from the runway. They assumed I would not check my personal portfolios until I was fully settled in London, weeks or maybe even months later. By the time I noticed the missing millions, the money would have already been laundered through Connor's failing businesses to pay off his defrauded investors. My own family had conspired to completely ruin my life just to save my brother from facing the consequences of his crimes. I closed my laptop, the anger settling into pure freezing determination. I did not barge into my parents' house throwing accusations. I did not pick up my phone to scream at my brother or demand an explanation from my mother. In my line of work, the moment you alert a fraudster that you are onto them, you lose your greatest strategic advantage. Confrontation breeds defensiveness, and defensiveness breeds the immediate destruction of evidence. If I tipped my hand now, my father would instantly accelerate his timeline. He would find a sympathetic local judge, or leverage his remaining advisory privileges to freeze my accounts in a protracted legal battle, trapping my assets in domestic purgatory, while Connor continued to bleed his institutional investors dry. I needed to move with absolute silence and overwhelming force. I needed to be entirely invisible until it was too late for them to react. The following morning, I took a personal day from my consulting firm and drove into the heart of the financial district. I was not looking for a friendly family lawyer or a polite estate planner. I was looking for a mercenary. I found him in a high-rise corner office overlooking the river. Alexander Vance was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless wealth protection firms in the city. He specialized in asset shielding hostile corporate divorces and international trust structures. He was famously expensive and notoriously cold, which made him exactly the man I needed for this job. I sat across from him in his expansive, minimalist office and laid out the entire situation without a single tear. I handed him the preliminary loan application with the forged signature, the records of my father's aggressive inquiries at the bank, and the digital footprint of the backdated power of attorney being drafted by Arthur Caldwell. Alexander reviewed the documents in complete silence. He did not offer any false sympathy about my family betraying me, and I did not ask for any. Instead, he looked at me and asked how much scorched earth I was willing to leave behind. I told him I did not care if the ground was permanently salted, as long as my inheritance was completely untouchable by the time my flight departed for London. Alexander leaned forward, steepling his fingers, and outlined a defensive strategy so aggressive it bordered on financial warfare. We could not just quietly remove my father from the existing domestic trust. That process required formal court filings, official notification periods, and administrative delays that Howard would easily spot and immediately contest. Instead, we were going to completely hollow out the domestic trust from the inside, leaving the legal structure perfectly intact, but entirely worthless. We spent the next 48 hours executing a masterclass in wealth relocation. Because I was still the primary unencumbered beneficiary of my late aunt's estate, and because my father had not yet finalized his fraudulent power of attorney, I still held the ultimate legal authority to direct my assets. I just had to do it faster than the banking bureaucracy could flag the massive outflow of capital. Alexander set up a new, completely impenetrable offshore trust based in the Isle of Man. The jurisdiction was specifically chosen because of its notoriously strict privacy laws and its absolute refusal to recognize domestic civil judgments without extensive, nearly impossible international litigation. Once the offshore entity was legally established, with nominee directors to shield my identity, the heavy lifting truly began. I sat in Alexander's office for 14 hours straight, signing endless stacks of authorization forms, transfer deeds, and liquidation orders. We systematically dissolved every vulnerable domestic account linked to my aunt's old estate. We initiated expedited wire transfers, pushing millions of dollars in liquid cash out of my local bank and routing it through a secure intermediary holding company before it finally landed safely in the offshore trust. We did not stop at the cash. I signed over the property deeds to the real estate my aunt had left me, transferring ownership directly into the name of the new offshore entity. We liquidated my mutual funds, sold off the vulnerable stock portfolios, and moved the proceeds overseas in staggered blocks to avoid triggering automated fraud alerts. It was an incredibly tense, high-wire act of financial maneuvering. Every time a bank compliance officer called to verify a massive transfer, my heart hammered against my ribs, terrified they would alert my father due to his advisory status. But Alexander took the phone each time, citing my upcoming international relocation to London as the primary justification for the aggressive restructuring. We used the exact same alibi my father had tried to use, twisting it to serve my protection instead of his theft. The sheer volume of wealth being shifted across borders was staggering, but Alexander moved with a practiced, predatory efficiency. He knew exactly which regulatory triggers to avoid and how to structure the wire transfers so they would clear internal bank audits seamlessly. As the final major portfolio was liquidated and the funds vanished into the digital ether toward the Isle of Man, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. My aunt's legacy, the security she had intended for me, was finally safe. But Alexander was not quite finished. He understood that if my father logged into the wealth management portal and saw that the accounts had simply been closed, Howard would panic. He would immediately call his shady lawyer Caldwell, and they would rush to file emergency injunctions to claw the money back before it fully cleared the international banking system. We needed to maintain the illusion that the trap my family had set was still perfectly functional. To achieve this, Alexander engineered a brilliant, devastating mirage. We did not close the domestic accounts. We left every single checking, savings, and investment account completely open and active. We just drained them down to the absolute bare minimum balances required to keep them from automatically shutting down due to inactivity, leaving just enough pennies to cover the monthly maintenance fees. The new offshore trust completely and permanently stripped any advisory privileges Howard once held. My father was now legally locked out of my actual wealth, but he had absolutely no idea. As far as the domestic banking portal was concerned, the account numbers were exactly the same. The login credentials had not changed. If Howard or Caldwell peeked at the system architecture, everything would look entirely normal on the surface. My money was now a ghost, completely untethered from American jurisdiction, untouchable by domestic creditors, and entirely immune to any fraudulent power of attorney my family tried to execute. I left Alexander's office late on a Thursday evening, the brisk city wind whipping around me as I walked to my car. My entire net worth was safely halfway across the world, secured behind walls of international banking law that my father and brother could never hope to breach. I had effectively disarmed their bomb, but I had not removed it from the building. I had carefully rewired it, setting the timer to detonate the exact moment they tried to steal from me. They were going to walk right into that conference room in a few days, full of arrogant entitlement, and trigger their own absolute ruin. I smiled, feeling a dangerous sense of calm settle over me, and drove home to wait for my mother to make her next move. She was their scout, and I knew she would not be able to resist checking on her little trap tonight. I did not have to wait long. It was barely past 7 o'clock when the sharp buzz of my apartment intercom shattered the quiet of my living room. The security screen showed my mother standing in the lobby. Bundled in her expensive camel hair coat, she held flattened moving boxes and packing tape. I unlocked the doors and waited for the elevator. When I opened my door, Barbara greeted me with a breathless smile that looked painted onto her face. She immediately launched into a monologue about how she could not bear her only daughter tackling an international move alone. I played along perfectly. I poured us some water, smiled tiredly, and told her I was incredibly stressed about relocating. I complained about visa applications and sorting my closet. Her eyes lit up with predatory excitement at my supposed distraction. She suggested that I go into my bedroom to focus on packing my clothes, while she kindly took care of organizing the paperwork in the living area. It was such a transparent maneuver that I almost laughed out loud. I agreed, with fabricated gratitude. I walked down the short hallway into my bedroom. I closed the door behind me, but left it open just a crack, leaving a gap wide enough to hear everything happening in the apartment. I moved quietly to the cracked bedroom door and listened. For the first 2 minutes, I heard the crinkling sound of packing tape and the rustling of cardboard boxes. Then those innocent sounds stopped completely. The heavy silence that followed was thick with intent. I heard the soft, unmistakable squeak of the hardwood floorboards right outside my home office. My office was located directly across from the living room, where I kept my physical financial records locked in a filing cabinet. I waited exactly 3 more minutes to ensure she was fully committed to her task. I wanted her to drop her guard entirely before I stepped out. I walked out of my bedroom, making no attempt to muffle my footsteps. I rounded the corner into the hallway and stopped dead in my tracks. My mother stood right in the middle of my home office. The desk lamp was switched on, casting a harsh pool of light across the mahogany surface. She had bypassed the moving boxes entirely. Instead, she was hunched over my desk, her hands frantically rifling through the stacks of mail and manila folders I had deliberately left out as bait. She had actually opened the top drawer of my filing cabinet and was actively thumbing through the hanging folders, scanning the tabs for anything resembling bank statements or trust documents. I leaned against the doorframe, crossed my arms, and cleared my throat loudly. Barbara jumped back as if she had been hit by a live electrical wire. She slammed the filing cabinet drawer shut with a loud metallic bang. Her hand flew to her chest, resting right over her heart, in a gesture of exaggerated shock. The color drained from her face for a second before her practiced mask slammed back into place. She let out a nervous laugh that sounded like glass cracking under pressure. She immediately began smoothing down the front of her blouse, darting her eyes everywhere except directly at my face. I kept my voice perfectly flat. I asked her exactly what she was looking for in my private filing cabinet. Barbara did not miss a beat. She seamlessly pivoted into her gaslighting routine, her voice dripping with artificial innocence. She claimed she was just trying to be helpful by organizing my mail forwarding forms. She insisted that international mail routing was incredibly complicated and that she simply wanted to make sure I had gathered all the necessary financial notices so nothing important got lost in the mail while I was in London. It was a brilliant, utterly shameless lie. She was standing in front of a filing cabinet containing years of tax returns, pretending she was looking for postage stamps. I did not raise my voice, and I did not call her out on the blatant absurdity of her excuse. I knew that if I challenged her, she would immediately report back to Howard that I was acting suspicious. I needed her to believe that her cover story had worked flawlessly. I needed her to leave my apartment utterly convinced that the domestic trust was still sitting exactly where they expected it to be. So I smiled. I walked over to the desk, casually picked up a stack of irrelevant junk mail and handed it to her. I thanked her for her concern and told her I had already set up digital mail forwarding for all my important banking documents. The moment I mentioned the word banking, I saw the tension instantly leave her shoulders. She let out a long breath of relief, believing she had successfully navigated the confrontation without raising my suspicions. But Barbara could never just leave a conversation without twisting the emotional knife one last time. As we walked back into the living room, she seamlessly transitioned from defensive snooping right into offensive guilt-tripping. She sat down on my sofa, letting her shoulders slump in a display of profound maternal exhaustion. She looked up at me with sad, pleading eyes and brought up my brother. She told me that Connor had barely slept in days. She said his wife, Whitney, was practically making herself sick with stress over their financial situation. She painted a picture of a struggling family on the brink of ruin, desperately needing a lifeline that only I could provide. Barbara reached out and tried to take my hand. She told me that Howard was working tirelessly to find a solution for Connor, but that the banking world was cruel. She said that family was the only true safety net anyone really had. She looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow and suggested that my move to London was a blessing because it would take me away from all this domestic stress. She wanted me to feel guilty for leaving her, ensuring I felt completely detached from the financial reality they were manipulating. I looked down at my mother, feeling a profound sense of disgust mixed with an icy, calculated triumph. I gently pulled my hand away from her grasp. I offered her a soft, oblivious smile, playing the role of the busy, distracted consultant perfectly. I told her I was sure Dad would figure everything out, just like he always did. I told her not to worry about my accounts because I was leaving everything in his capable hands while I focused entirely on my new job overseas. I watched the triumph bloom in her eyes. She actually smiled, a genuine, relieved smile, firmly believing their trap was still set, armed and ready to trigger. She left my apartment 30 minutes later, walking to the elevator with a light, victorious step, carrying her empty moving boxes with her. She was heading straight home to tell Howard that the coast was entirely clear. I locked the deadbolt behind her, leaned against the heavy wood of my front door, and let out a long, quiet breath. I had given them absolutely nothing. They were going to walk into Mr. Caldwell's law office completely blind, holding the detonator to a bomb that I had already wired directly back to their own foundation. The following morning, my phone rang just as I was taping up the last of my moving boxes. It was the morning of my scheduled departure for London. The caller ID flashed with my father's name, and I let it ring twice before answering, forcing my voice to sound tired and slightly overwhelmed by the logistics of international relocation. Howard did not bother with pleasantries. He dove straight into his script, his tone a perfect blend of paternal concern and executive authority. He told me that before I left the country, we needed to have a brief farewell and restructuring meeting. He said he had arranged for us to sit down at Arthur Caldwell's downtown law office to finalize some routine administrative paperwork regarding my aunt's trust. He framed the entire meeting as a necessary precaution, a simple way to ensure my financial portfolio remained secure and properly managed while I was distracted by my new life overseas. I listened to him spin his web of lies, keeping my breathing steady and my responses appropriately docile. I told him that I appreciated him taking the time to help me get everything organized. I agreed to meet them at the law office at 2 o'clock that afternoon. When I disconnected the call, a profound sense of calm settled over me. The board was set. Arthur Caldwell operated out of a high-rise building in the most expensive sector of the financial district. His law firm was designed to intimidate. The lobby was a massive expanse of dark polished marble, vaulted ceilings, and aggressive modern art that screamed of quiet, untouchable wealth. It was the kind of environment built specifically to make ordinary people feel small and to make wealthy people feel invincible. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early, wearing a simple tailored charcoal suit. I carried only one item with me, a structured black leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the complete forensic audit, the documentation of Connor's massive financial fraud, the proof of the forged collateral guarantee, and the confirmation documents for my new offshore trust. It was the exact weapon that would dismantle their entire operation, resting quietly by my side. I approached the reception desk, gave my name, and was directed to a sprawling waiting area outside the main conference rooms. I sat down on a stiff leather sofa, placed my briefcase on the floor directly next to my ankle, and waited for the rest of my family to arrive. They did not just walk into the waiting room. They paraded into it. Connor and his wife Whitney emerged from the elevators looking like they had just robbed a luxury department store. Connor was wearing a brand new bespoke navy suit that fit him a little too snugly, paired with a flashy silk tie and a watch that easily cost more than most people's annual rent. But it was Whitney who truly captured the essence of their shared delusion. She strutted across the marble floor, wearing head-to-toe designer labels, her heels clicking loudly to announce her presence. Draped around her neck, catching the recessed lighting of the law office and throwing sharp, arrogant glints of light across the room, was a massive diamond tennis necklace. It was a brand new, spectacularly expensive piece of jewelry that she absolutely did not own the last time I saw her. They were practically vibrating with a toxic, giddy energy. They were not behaving like a couple on the brink of catastrophic bankruptcy and institutional foreclosure. They were behaving like lottery winners waiting to collect their oversized check. My parents arrived a few minutes later, stepping off the elevator with matching expressions of solemn, business-like purpose. Howard carried his own leather portfolio, looking every inch the commanding patriarch, ready to execute a hostile corporate takeover. Barbara trailed slightly behind him, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Connor and Whitney. The moment my mother saw the sparkling diamond necklace resting against Whitney's collarbone, she let out a delighted gasp. She rushed over to her daughter-in-law, reaching out to touch the heavy stones with unbridled admiration. Whitney beamed, her voice carrying across the quiet waiting room with absolutely no regard for professional decorum. She loudly bragged to Barbara that the necklace was an early celebration gift from Connor. She tossed her hair back and declared that they were celebrating his upcoming business windfall. She did not even glance in my direction as she proudly announced that Connor's real estate firm was about to secure a massive influx of capital and that they had already started shopping for a vacation home in Aspen to celebrate his entrepreneurial genius. I sat perfectly still on the leather sofa, watching the entire grotesque performance unfold right in front of me. I listened to my sister-in-law map out exactly how she planned to spend my inheritance. They were already spending my money in their heads. They had already mentally liquidated the safety net my aunt had left me, converting my financial security into diamond necklaces, luxury vacations in Colorado, and bespoke suits for a man who was actively defrauding his own investors. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of the scene was almost difficult to process. They were standing mere feet away from the woman they were conspiring to rob, boldly celebrating the spoils of a crime they had not even successfully committed yet. They truly believed I was that naive, that compliant, and that blind to their true nature. The audacity required to flaunt those diamonds in my presence, knowing exactly how they intended to pay for them by the end of the day, solidified every defensive measure I had taken over the past week. Any lingering shred of familial guilt I might have harbored completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical anticipation for the reckoning that was about to occur. Howard finally turned his attention to me. He offered a tight, paternal smile that looked more like a grimace. He walked over to where I was sitting and patted me condescendingly on the shoulder, completely ignoring the fact that his son was currently broadcasting their financial motives to the entire reception area. He seemed completely unbothered by the blatant display of greed happening just a few feet away, entirely confident in his absolute control over the situation and my future. Howard asked me if I was ready to get this tedious paperwork out of the way so I could focus on my exciting new adventure in Europe. He spoke to me as if I were a naive child who needed to be carefully guided through a remarkably simple chore. I looked up at him, then let my gaze drift over to Connor, who was currently adjusting his expensive new cuffs, and then to Whitney, who was still practically petting her new diamonds. The stark contrast between their arrogant celebration and the absolute financial ruin waiting for them inside my briefcase was staggering. I did not break eye contact with my father. I offered him a polite, agreeable smile, carefully maintaining the facade of the obedient daughter he believed me to be. I told him that I was absolutely more than ready to finalize everything with him today. I reached down and wrapped my hand securely around the handle of my leather briefcase, gripping it incredibly tight. I told him I was looking forward to seeing exactly how the restructuring process was going to play out behind closed doors. Howard seemed to accept my polite smile at face value, completely missing the double meaning of my words. He turned away to speak with my mother, leaving me momentarily alone with my brother. Connor immediately seized the opportunity to step into the space our father had vacated. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned against the edge of a mahogany side table, looking down at me with a mixture of pity and profound arrogance. He asked me if I was all packed for my little European vacation. I calmly corrected him, stating that a multi-year forensic consulting contract in London was hardly a vacation. Connor just rolled his eyes and let out a harsh, condescending laugh. He told me I could dress it up with whatever fancy corporate titles I wanted, but everyone in the family knew exactly what I was actually doing. According to Connor, I was running away. He crossed his arms over his chest and accused me of fleeing the country because I simply could not handle the pressure of real adult responsibilities. He claimed that while I was busy running off to hide in a foreign city, he was the one staying behind to carry the true weight of the family legacy. He spoke about his failing luxury real estate venture as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, completely ignoring the fact that his so-called heavy lifting consisted entirely of defrauding investors and stealing from his younger sister. I sat there, on the leather sofa, letting his words wash over me without reacting. My silence only seemed to embolden him. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice into a mocking whisper. He told me that real wealth creation required a spine, a willingness to stay in the trenches and fight for every dollar. He pointed to the massive diamond tennis necklace resting against his wife's collarbone. He proudly declared that those diamonds were the result of a man who knew how to dominate the market, not someone who ran away at the first sign of difficulty. Whitney, hearing her new jewelry being discussed, sashayed over to join her husband. She rested a manicured hand on Connor's arm and offered me a sickeningly sweet smile. She chimed in, adding that they would be sure to send me a postcard from their new vacation home in Aspen once the winter season started. She told me not to worry about my finances while I was away, because Connor and Howard were going to make sure my little inheritance was put to good, productive use. The psychological warfare was relentless, designed to make me feel small, incompetent, and entirely dependent on their superior business acumen. They were trying to break my spirit right there in the waiting room, ensuring I would walk into the conference room feeling too defeated to question whatever documents they put in front of me. I looked at the two of them perfectly matched in their delusion and felt a profound sense of peace. I did not need to defend my career or my choices to people who were about to lose absolutely everything. Before Connor could launch into another monologue about his entrepreneurial brilliance, Howard stepped back into our circle. He placed a firm, silencing hand on Connor's shoulder, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch perfectly. He looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured parental concern. His eyes softened and his voice dropped to a low, comforting timbre that sent a sudden chill straight down my spine. He told me that Connor was just being protective and that I should not take his teasing to heart. Howard sat down on the edge of the sofa next to me, invading my personal space to create a false sense of intimacy. He reached out and gently patted my hand, the very hand that was currently gripping the handle of my briefcase. He told me that relocating to London was going to be an incredibly stressful and distracting experience. He painted a picture of a chaotic international move, filled with visa complications, finding a new apartment, and adjusting to a grueling new corporate job. He said the absolute last thing I needed to be worrying about was managing a complex domestic trust from across the Atlantic Ocean. He insisted that international banking regulations were far too complicated for a busy consultant like me to handle alone, without his constant, dedicated, and highly experienced oversight and protection. He looked me right in the eyes, his performance flawlessly sincere. He assured me that leaving my finances under his expert control was simply the safest, most logical way to protect my wealth while I navigated a brand new country. He promised me that he would monitor the markets daily, adjust the portfolios as needed, and ensure that my future remained completely secure. He framed his impending theft not as an act of desperation, but as an act of profound, selfless parental love. He wanted me to believe he was bravely taking on a very heavy personal burden just to make my life a little bit easier. It was the absolute ultimate gaslighting maneuver. He was looking his daughter in the face, acting like my greatest protector, while actively preparing to drain my life savings to cover the massive debts of his golden child. I intentionally kept my breathing steady and my facial expression perfectly blank. I nodded slowly, allowing him to believe his emotional manipulation was working. I told him I appreciated his willingness to handle the administrative burdens for me. I watched the tension completely leave his shoulders. He genuinely thought he had won. He believed I was a compliant, trusting daughter who was happily handing over the keys to the vault. The quiet murmur of the reception area was suddenly broken by the heavy, ominous sound of solid oak doors clicking open. I turned my head to see the entrance to the conference room swinging wide. Standing in the doorway was Arthur Caldwell. He wore a sharply tailored gray suit and a completely predatory smile. His eyes darted across the waiting room, taking in my parents, Connor Whitney, and finally landing on me. He looked exactly like a spider, watching a fly land gently into the center of its web. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, smoothed his lapels, and gestured broadly toward the massive, windowless room behind him. He announced that everything was prepared and asked us to please step inside so we could finalize the necessary restructuring documents. The sheer audacity of the entire performance had perfectly set the stage. The trap was officially sprung. Howard stood up first, buttoning his suit jacket with a satisfied, commanding air. Connor offered Whitney his arm, grinning like a man walking into a victory lap. My mother fell into step right behind them, her face glowing with eager anticipation. I was the last one to rise from the leather sofa. I stood up slowly, planting my feet firmly on the polished marble floor. I adjusted my grip on my black leather briefcase, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the forensic audit resting inside. I offered Caldwell a polite, unassuming smile as I walked past him and stepped across the threshold into the grand conference room, ready to burn their entire world to the ground. They had built this trap just for me, completely unaware that I'd spent the last week actively loading it with highly explosive financial ammunition. The transition into the main conference room felt exactly like stepping into a perfectly engineered airtight vault. Arthur Caldwell led the way, his leather shoes sinking silently into the plush carpet. The massive room was dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that stretched almost 20 feet across the floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the downtown financial district, but the heavy interior felt entirely disconnected from the outside world. I took a seat near the middle of the table, placing my black leather briefcase on the floor right next to my ankle. Howard immediately took the position at the head of the table, sitting down with the heavy, practiced authority of a chief executive officer, calling a hostile board meeting to order. Barbara sat to his immediate right, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her face composed into a flawless mask of serene, maternal support. Connor and Whitney took the plush seats directly across from me. Whitney was still adjusting the clasp of her new diamond tennis necklace, while Connor leaned back and stretched his legs out, looking completely relaxed and supremely confident in his impending payday. Caldwell remained standing for a brief moment. He walked over to a polished wooden credenza, picked up a thick, meticulously bound stack of legal documents, and carried them over to the table. The sheer physical weight of the paperwork landed on the mahogany surface with a dull, heavy thud that echoed in the quiet room. Caldwell slid the towering stack of documents directly across the smooth table until it rested right in front of me. He took his seat next to my father, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and folded his hands over his own leather portfolio. He looked at me with a completely manufactured expression of professional courtesy, playing the role of the helpful family attorney perfectly. He announced that he had prepared all the necessary transfer deeds and the irrevocable power of attorney forms we had previously discussed. He claimed that these dense legal documents were specifically drafted to ensure my financial portfolios remained actively managed, highly profitable, and fully protected while I was living overseas. He smoothly glossed over the extreme legal power hidden within the pages, framing the total surrender of my life savings as a standard, everyday administrative procedure that wealthy families executed all the time. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a heavy gold pen, and slid it across the polished wood, stopping just inches from my right hand. Before I could even look down at the title page of the paperwork, Howard leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. He picked up his rolls seamlessly, dropping his voice into that low, comforting register he always used when he was trying to manipulate me into total submission. He looked me right in the eyes and told me that he knew this seemed like a lot of dense legal jargon, but that I needed to trust him completely. He swore that taking over my accounts was a heavy personal burden, but one he was willing to carry because he loved his daughter and wanted to see me succeed in London. He firmly ordered me to pick up the pen and sign the signature pages marked with the bright yellow sticky notes. He said we needed to restructure everything today for my own good so I could board my flight with a completely clear mind and no financial distractions holding me back. Connor let out a quiet, scoffing laugh from across the table, muttering that I should just sign the papers quickly so they could all get to their expensive lunch reservations on time. I looked down at the gold pen resting on the table, then up at the towering stack of legal documents designed to legally strip me of every single asset my aunt had left me. I did not reach for the pen. I did not touch the paperwork. I simply leaned back in my leather chair, crossed my arms firmly over my chest, and looked directly into my father's eyes. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the tension in the room to build until it was almost suffocating. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of any anger or panic, and I stated clearly that I would not be signing anything today, or ever. The reaction across the table was instantaneous and volatile. The benevolent, caring expression on my father's face vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a dark, rigid mask of absolute fury. The veins in his neck visibly tightened as he slammed his hand down flat against the mahogany table, rattling the gold pen. He demanded to know what I meant, his voice losing all its manufactured warmth and taking on a sharp, threatening edge that used to terrify me when I was a child. Barbara let out a small, distressed gasp, clutching her pearls and asking why I was being so incredibly difficult after they had gone through all the trouble of setting up this meeting for my benefit. She laid the guilt on thick, claiming my stubbornness was breaking her heart. Connor shot up from his chair, leaning aggressively over the table toward me. He pointed a finger directly at my face and started yelling that I was acting like a paranoid, ungrateful brat who did not understand how the real world operated. He demanded that I stop wasting everyone's valuable time, pick up the pen, and just sign the damn papers so he could get back to running his business. Whitney rolled her eyes loudly, crossing her arms and complaining that I always had to make everything about myself and ruin family events with my endless need for drama. The sheer volume of their combined outrage filled the soundproof conference room, creating a chaotic echo chamber of extreme entitlement and emotional manipulation. They were trying to bully me into submission, using the same intimidation tactics that had kept our family in line for decades. In my line of work, I had faced down billionaire executives who threw similar tantrums, so my family's performance did not move me. But before my father could escalate his threats, Arthur Caldwell held up a single manicured hand to silence the room. The lawyer did not look angry about my refusal. He looked incredibly amused by my defiance. He let out a low, predatory sneer, thoroughly enjoying his position of perceived power. Caldwell pulled his silver laptop closer to him on the table. He opened the screen with a smooth, practiced motion. He looked over at my father, who was still glaring at me, and calmly told him to relax. Caldwell adjusted his glasses and looked back at me, his smile widening into a look of arrogant victory. He stated that it honestly did not matter if I refused to sign the physical documents today. He turned to Howard and casually mentioned that they did not actually need my ink signature to proceed with the wealth consolidation. Caldwell proudly reminded my father that they already possessed the preliminary digital authorization required to execute the domestic transfers. The lawyer looked at me with cold, triumphant eyes and declared that my physical signature was merely a polite courtesy. He called it a simple formality meant to keep paper files neat for the auditors. He boasted that he could initiate the wire transfers through the wealth management portal right now, bypassing my stubborn refusal entirely. Without waiting for my answer, Caldwell tapped the control panel built into the table. A projection screen descended from the ceiling, and he connected his silver laptop to it. The private banking portal appeared on the wall in front of us. He wanted everyone to witness the transfer, especially Howard. What he intended as a public demonstration of my defeat was about to become a permanent record of their failed theft. Caldwell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and settled into his plush leather chair. He began to narrate his every move, his voice dripping with condescension. He boasted about the marvels of modern digital wealth management, explaining how seamless and instantaneous the transfer of millions of dollars could be when you had the proper high-level administrative clearance. He pulled up the secure login portal from my private banking institution, the logo flashing brightly across the projection screen. He looked over at my father, offering him a deeply deferential nod. Caldwell stated that while a physical signature on the transfer deeds would have been a lovely traditional touch to keep the paper files neat, Howard's established digital footprint as my appointed financial advisor was more than sufficient to override my stubbornness. He praised my father for having the incredible foresight to set up these emergency wealth preservation protocols over a decade ago. My father absorbed the compliment like a man receiving an award. Howard leaned back in his oversized executive chair, completely relaxed, and unbuttoned his suit jacket. He reached out, poured himself a glass of sparkling water from a crystal pitcher on the table, and took a slow, victorious sip. He looked down the length of the table at me, his eyes gleaming with a cold, absolute triumph. He genuinely believed he had broken me. He thought my silence was the silence of a defeated, helpless daughter who had finally realized she was entirely outmatched. Barbara mirrored his satisfaction perfectly. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture radiating serene, maternal relief. She offered a soft, delicate sigh and mentioned how nice it was that we could resolve this ugly family tension without resorting to a messy, drawn-out court battle. She was actively pretending that stealing my entire life savings was actually an act of deep familial healing. But it was Connor who truly embodied the grotesque reality of the moment. My brother could not sit still. He was practically vibrating in his seat, leaning so far forward over the polished wood that his chest was nearly resting on the table. He was literally rubbing his hands together, his eyes locked onto the projection screen with a desperate, feverish hunger. He looked like a starving man staring at a feast. Whitney sat next to him, absent-mindedly twisting her new diamond tennis necklace around her finger, whispering to Connor about whether the funds would clear in time for them to wire a deposit on the Aspen vacation property by tomorrow morning. They were not even trying to hide their greed anymore. They felt completely untouchable, surrounded by the expensive legal architecture that was about to legitimize their theft. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the handle of my black leather briefcase. I kept my breathing even and shallow, slowing my heart rate down to a steady, calm rhythm. I watched Caldwell's fingers fly across his keyboard. He opened a secondary window on the projection screen, displaying a meticulously organized spreadsheet. It contained the exact routing details, account numbers, and routing codes for every single vulnerable domestic account tied to my aunt's original trust. He also had the destination information fully prepared, prominently displaying the corporate routing number for Connor's failing luxury real estate holding company. Caldwell announced that he was initiating the final consolidation protocol. He copied the first account number from his spreadsheet, my primary high-yield investment portfolio, and pasted it directly into the bank's secure wire transfer portal. The sheer mechanical precision of the theft was breathtaking. Caldwell did not stop with just one account. He was going for absolute, total liquidation. He pasted the routing number for my secondary savings account, the liquid cash reserves, and the holding accounts attached to the property deeds my aunt had left me. He methodically linked every single domestic financial artery I possessed directly to Connor's corporate sinkhole. He narrated the process aloud, confirming the last 4 digits of each account as he added it to the master transfer ledger. He typed in the transfer amounts, intentionally leaving just a few $100s in each account to cover any lingering maintenance fees, ensuring the accounts would not automatically flag a complete closure. He was executing the exact strategy Alexander Vance and I had anticipated, right down to the very last decimal point. The tension in the conference room thickened, becoming almost a physical weight pressing down on the space. The air felt unnaturally still. The only sounds were the rapid clicking of Caldwell's keyboard and the soft, excited breaths coming from my brother across the table. Connor leaned even closer, his eyes wide and unblinking, tracking the cursor on the screen as if it were a physical object bringing him salvation. Howard set his water glass down, sitting up slightly straighter, his posture tightening with the anticipation of his ultimate victory. He was watching me closely now, waiting for the exact moment my composure would shatter, waiting for the tears and the panic that he assumed were imminent. I gave him absolutely nothing. I kept my face blank, my eyes fixed on the projection screen, playing the role of the paralyzed victim flawlessly. Caldwell finished inputting the final account details. He performed a dramatic sweeping review of the transfer ledger, ensuring every number was perfectly aligned. He turned his chair slightly to face my father, treating the moment like a grand ceremonial ribbon cutting. He asked Howard for his final verbal authorization to execute the emergency wealth preservation protocols and initiate the immediate transfer of the consolidated funds to the designated holding company. Howard did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He looked directly at me, a cold, empty smile forming on his lips, and he gave Caldwell a firm, authoritative yes. He told the lawyer to execute the transfer immediately. Caldwell turned back to his laptop with a satisfied smirk. He moved his mouse across the screen, hovering the white cursor directly over the bright blue button labeled Execute Transfer. He pressed down on his trackpad with a sharp, definitive click. The web page on the massive projection screen immediately shifted. The transfer ledger disappeared, replaced by a gray screen featuring a small circular loading wheel in the dead center. The little circle spun round and round, a digital representation of the banking system processing the massive multi-million-dollar request. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Connor gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. Whitney stopped playing with her diamonds. Barbara leaned forward, her lips parted in anticipation. Howard watched the spinning wheel with an expression of absolute, unshakable triumph. The system communicated with the bank's highly secure servers, calculating the requested transfer amounts against the current live balances of my domestic accounts. The loading wheel spun one final time, the data packets flying across the financial network, preparing to reveal the ultimate reality of my financial portfolio to the people who were trying to steal it. The bright blue loading wheel on the massive projection screen froze. A metallic chime echoed from Arthur Caldwell's laptop, signaling the banking portal had completed the synchronization. The gray background dissolved, replaced by the stark white dashboard of my private wealth management account. The bank's logo anchored the top left corner, projecting an aura of absolute financial security across the darkened conference room. In the center of the screen, a neatly formatted summary table materialized. This was the master ledger that consolidated every domestic account tied to my late aunt's estate. Caldwell let out a smug breath and leaned back in his plush leather chair. He did not bother to look at the screen. He was too busy looking at my father, waiting for his validation. But Howard was not looking at Caldwell. My father was staring directly at the projection screen, his eyes wide and unblinking. The victorious smirk that had been plastered across his face moments ago was wiped away. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He slowly lowered his crystal water glass to the mahogany table, his hand trembling so violently that the ice cubes rattled. I kept my gaze fixed on the projection screen, savoring the absolute beauty of the digital display. Right beneath the bold black header labeled Total Consolidated Assets, the system generated the final balance of my domestic portfolio. The numbers were displayed in a massive font. Total available balance, $42.16. Below that, the itemized accounts painted a picture of absolute financial desolation. The primary high-yield investment portfolio showed a balance of exactly $12. The liquid cash reserve account, the one Connor was relying on to cover his margin call, displayed $15.10. The holding accounts, attached to the property deeds, were entirely empty, registering a flat zero. I had left just enough spare change to cover the automatic monthly maintenance fees, ensuring the accounts remained active for this exact moment. The silence in the conference room was suffocating. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes an explosion. Caldwell finally noticed nobody was congratulating him. He dropped his hands and turned his attention to the projection screen. The arrogant sneer on his face physically melted. He blinked rapidly, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses higher up on the bridge of his nose. He leaned so far forward, his chest pressed against the edge of the mahogany table. He let out a low, confused stammer. He muttered something about a display error or a localized server timeout. Caldwell grabbed his wireless mouse, his hand shaking so badly the white cursor vibrated erratically across the background. The frantic clicking of the plastic mouse button echoed sharply in the silent room. He dragged the cursor to the top of the browser and slammed the refresh button. The loading wheel spun for 2 agonizing seconds before the screen reloaded. The layout snapped back into place. Total available balance, $42.16. The numbers had not magically multiplied. There were no hidden funds waiting to clear. The domestic trust was a completely hollowed-out shell. Caldwell began breathing heavily, a fine sheen of sweat breaking out across his forehead. He frantically clicked into the individual account tabs, desperately hunting for the millions of dollars he had promised my father he could secure. He opened the transaction history for the primary investment portfolio. The screen populated with a dense list of aggressive outgoing wire transfers, all dated exactly 72 hours ago. The destination fields were redacted, protected by international banking privacy laws, showing only that the funds had been routed to an undisclosed offshore holding entity. Caldwell slowly pulled his hand away from the mouse. He turned his head, with agonizing slowness, to look at my father. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at Howard, his professional reputation collapsing. Barbara was the first person to break the heavy silence. She was staring up at the projection screen, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She had spent her entire life insulated by my father's wealth. She did not understand routing numbers or offshore trusts, but she understood that the screen was supposed to show millions of dollars, and instead it showed the price of a cheap dinner. She looked over at Howard, her voice trembling, and asked him what those numbers meant. Howard did not answer her. He could not even look at her. He was gripping the arms of his executive chair so tightly that his knuckles were stark white, his breathing coming in shallow gasps. He realized in that exact moment that he had completely lost control. The reality of the situation finally registered in Barbara's mind. The safety net was gone. The money they needed to save their social standing did not exist. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching the fabric of her expensive silk blouse. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and all the artificial strength she used to maintain her perfect, suburban matriarch persona instantly vanished. She slumped sideways, her shoulder hitting the armrest of her heavy leather chair, as she effectively fainted, sliding down into a lifeless heap. Howard did not reach out to catch her. He was entirely paralyzed by his own financial ruin. Connor did not freeze. The golden child, the brilliant entrepreneur who had never faced a single real consequence in his life, erupted into pure, violent chaos. Connor jumped up from his plush leather seat with so much explosive force that the heavy chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the carpeted floor. His face turned a deep shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging visibly against his skin. He slammed his fists down onto the polished mahogany table, the impact rattling the water pitchers. He started screaming at the absolute top of his lungs. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Arthur Caldwell. Connor accused the lawyer of being an incompetent hack. He screamed that Caldwell must have messed up the routing numbers and that he had somehow wired the money to the wrong destination. Connor was entirely incapable of accepting that he had been outsmarted. He demanded that Caldwell fix the computer glitch right this second. He leaned over the table, spit flying from his lips, yelling that his institutional investors were going to seize his house and liquidate his entire company tomorrow morning if that wire transfer did not clear immediately. He sounded like a desperate, terrified child throwing a tantrum. Whitney sat frozen next to her screaming husband. She had dropped her hand from her diamond tennis necklace, her fingers now gripping the edge of the table. Her mouth hung open in silent horror. She looked at the screen, then at Connor, and then down at the expensive designer clothes she was wearing. The illusion of her upcoming Aspen vacation home and her limitless luxury budget shattered into a million sharp, painful pieces right in front of her eyes. She was tethered to a man who was about to lose absolutely everything, and the realization hit her with the force of a freight train. I sat perfectly still on my side of the long mahogany table, completely untouched by the screaming, the fainting, and the absolute chaos erupting all around me. I kept my hands resting lightly on the handle of my black leather briefcase. I watched my brother melt down. I watched my mother slump in her chair. And I watched my father realize that his ultimate trap had been completely dismantled. The sheer, overwhelming panic filling the grand conference room was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs, and prepared to deliver the final, fatal blow. I slowly reached down to the floor beside my ankle, my fingers wrapping firmly around the thick leather handle of my black briefcase. I lifted it onto my lap, the crisp, metallic snap of the brass latches cutting right through the chaotic sounds of Connor hyperventilating across the room. I flipped the leather top open. Inside, resting perfectly, undisturbed, was a complete, undeniable masterpiece of financial reconstruction. It was a 300-page forensic audit dossier, custom-bound in thick black cover stock. It was a meticulously organized collection detailing every single illicit transaction, hidden liability, and desperate fraudulent maneuver my family had attempted to execute over the past 2 years. I grasped the heavy, rigid spine of the document and pulled it out of the briefcase. I stood up from my plush leather chair, holding the massive book in both hands. I lifted the dossier high enough for everyone in the room to see the thick binding, and then I tossed it directly onto the exact center of the polished mahogany table. The heavy dossier landed with a thunderous, concussive thud that practically shook the crystal water pitchers. The loud impact acted like a physical shockwave in the grand conference room, instantly snapping Arthur Caldwell out of his frantic clicking and forcing my brother to freeze mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes slowly tracked away from the zero balance on the massive projection screen and locked onto the thick black book resting in the middle of the table. I kept my posture perfectly straight, standing tall over the people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I looked directly at Arthur Caldwell, who was still gripping his wireless mouse with white, trembling knuckles. I told him, in a voice so incredibly cold and steady that there was no computer glitch. I slowly turned my gaze away from the disgraced lawyer and locked eyes with my father. Howard was still slumped in his executive chair, his face a pale, sickly mask of absolute defeat. I projected my voice so that it carried to every corner of the soundproof room. I told my father that I had completely liquidated the domestic trust. I explained that exactly 72 hours ago, I had methodically drained every single cent out of those vulnerable accounts and moved my entire inheritance into a highly secure offshore blind trust based in the Isle of Man. I informed him that the new trust structure completely stripped him of his advisory privileges and that the money was now locked behind an impenetrable wall of international banking law that absolutely none of them could legally touch. Howard let out a pathetic, wheezing noise from deep within his chest. The commanding patriarch who had summoned me under the guise of paternal care was entirely gone. He realized that I had not just anticipated his ambush, but that I had weaponized his own timeline against him. I had used the chaos of my upcoming international relocation to execute a flawless financial extraction right under his nose. He looked at the thick black dossier resting on the table, and then he looked back up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. He finally understood that I did not just move my money. He understood that I had spent the last week actively investigating why he was so desperate to steal it in the first place. Next to him, my mother was just beginning to stir from her theatrical fainting spell. Barbara fluttered her eyelashes, letting out a soft, confused moan as she slowly pushed herself up from the armrest of her chair. She blinked heavily, looking around the tense conference room, her gaze finally landing on the zero balance still glowing brightly on the projection screen. She let out another sharp, whining cry, pressing her hands against her face as the grim reality of their financial destruction washed over her all over again. While my parents were paralyzed by shock, Connor was accelerating past panic into absolute, unhinged rage. The realization that my money was permanently gone broke whatever fragile tether he had left to reality. He realized that he was going to have to face his angry institutional investors tomorrow morning completely empty-handed. He was going to lose his luxury real estate company, his expensive cars, his heavily mortgaged house, and his completely fabricated identity as a brilliant entrepreneur. Connor stared at the black dossier on the table, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. His face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. He took a sudden, aggressive step toward my side of the table, kicking his chair backwards so hard that it tumbled over onto the carpet. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany wood, screaming my name with a volume that made Whitney physically flinch away from him. He shrieked that I had absolutely no right to move that money without consulting the family first. He yelled that I was a selfish, ungrateful traitor who was intentionally trying to destroy his life and ruin his marriage. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at my face, his voice cracking as he spewed a frantic stream of legal threats. He screamed that he was going to hire the most ruthless litigators in the city and drag me into court for breach of family trust. He threatened to have a judge reverse the offshore transfers. He shouted that Dad was the appointed financial advisor and that by locking him out, I had committed a massive illegal violation of fiduciary procedure. He was throwing every single legal buzzword he could think of against the wall, desperately hoping something would stick. Whitney was openly weeping now. She was sitting in her plush chair, her hands gripping the edges of her designer handbag, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face and ruining her expensive makeup. She looked at her husband, throwing a violent tantrum like a spoiled toddler, and the illusion of his massive upcoming windfall completely evaporated. She reached up with a shaking hand and touched the heavy diamond tennis necklace resting against her skin. She finally understood that the jewelry she was wearing was not a celebration gift. It was a massive, unpaid debt purchased by a man who was actively drowning in financial ruin. She let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying her face in her hands. I stood there in perfect silence, allowing my brother to exhaust himself. I let him scream his empty threats and pound his fists until his voice grew hoarse and his face dripped with sweat. I did not flinch away. I simply waited until he ran out of breath and was forced to stop yelling. I slowly reached out and placed my hand flat against the thick black cover of the forensic audit dossier resting in the center of the table. I dragged the heavy book across the polished wood, pulling it directly in front of me. I looked at Connor, offering him a smile completely devoid of any warmth or sibling affection. I told him that he was more than welcome to try and sue me for breach of trust, but that he was going to have a very difficult time finding a lawyer willing to take his case once the federal authorities saw what I had uncovered. Keeping my eyes locked entirely on his terrified, sweating face, I calmly reached down and flipped the heavy black cover open to page 1. The first page was not an accusation. It was a map. Across the top in black type, I had written Connor Hale Real Estate Group, Sources, Uses, and Misappropriation of Investor Capital. Beneath it was a flowchart connecting Connor's flagship company to 11 limited liability companies he had never disclosed to his investors. I rotated the dossier so Connor could see it. His eyes followed the arrows from one shell company to another, and the rage in his face began to collapse into fear. I explained that his luxury development fund had collected more than $8 million from investors over 2 years. According to his offering documents, that money was restricted to property acquisition, construction deposits, and insured project expenses. His bank records told a different story. Nearly $900,000 had paid for leased vehicles, private club dues, designer clothing, vacations, and the downtown office he used as a stage set for investor meetings. Another $1.6 million had passed through consulting companies with no employees' contracts or legitimate activity. 2 were registered to addresses connected to Arthur Caldwell's law firm. Caldwell's head snapped up. He started to say that corporate registrations proved nothing. I turned to tab 4 and pulled out invoices bearing his firm's letterhead. They described strategic zoning services that had never occurred. The payment dates matched transfers from Connor's investor accounts, and the money moved again, less than 24 hours later, into a holding company controlled by Howard. Caldwell stopped speaking. Connor had promised his earliest investors guaranteed quarterly returns, even though none of his developments had produced operating income. To create the illusion of success, he used deposits from investors to pay distributions to earlier ones. I had reconstructed the cycle, transaction by transaction. Every time fresh capital entered the flagship fund, a portion was routed through a management account and sent out as a supposed investment return. The pattern was not a temporary cash flow problem. It was the defining mechanism of the business. Connor insisted the transfers were bridge financing. I opened the dossier to emails recovered from a civil filing. In one, he told his controller to delay recording a new investor's deposit until after quarterly statements were issued. In another, he ordered an assistant to label payments to earlier investors as project revenue. The last email contained 6 words that destroyed any claim of innocent bookkeeping. Use the new money. Buy time. Whitney lowered her hands from her face and looked at Connor as though she no longer recognized him. Connor refused to meet her eyes. I turned to the section marked Collateral Fraud. There were the 3 requests Howard had submitted to the bank within 48 hours. Each tried to pledge my aunt's trust against a commercial loan benefiting Connor's company. Howard had represented that I knew about the loan, supported it, and was unavailable only because of my London relocation. I placed the preliminary guarantee beside a verified sample of my signature. Then I laid out the handwriting comparison commissioned by an independent document examiner. The pressure points, pen lifts, and repeated curves showed that my name had been copied from an older trust instruction form. Howard claimed the signature issue could be corrected and that he had acted under his advisory authority. I turned another page. The Emergency Wealth Preservation Clause did not permit him to guarantee a third party's debt. It allowed temporary protective transfers only when my own estate faced an immediate threat. The bank's notes recorded Howard describing Connor's margin call as a threat to the family's collective wealth. There was no such legal category. He had converted a limited advisory privilege into fabricated authorization by lying about the beneficiary, the emergency, and the destination. Then I reached Caldwell's section. The draft power of attorney had been created a week before the family dinner, but its effective date had been altered to make it appear that I signed it months earlier. Embedded document data identified the computer used to create the file and when Caldwell's office changed the date. The draft granted Howard authority to close my accounts, sell inherited property, borrow against the estate, and transfer assets into companies in which he or Connor held an interest. A notarization block had already been prepared, even though I had never appeared before the named notary. Caldwell pushed his chair back and warned me that confidential legal work product could not be used against his clients. I told him the documents had been attached to a public probate filing and supported by records lawfully obtained from the bank and civil court dockets. His confidentiality speech was 3 days too late. I opened the final evidentiary tab. It contained investor complaints, loan records, bank access logs, the forged guarantee document, metadata, property valuations, false invoices, and a ledger tracing the diverted money. Every allegation was cross-referenced to a source document. Every account number had been verified. Every conclusion could be recreated by another examiner without relying on my word. "You said you were going to sue me," I told Connor. "Please do. Discovery would require you to produce the same records I have already reconstructed." His lips parted, but nothing came out. "You cannot sue me for protecting property that belongs solely to me," I continued. "But the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation can certainly prosecute you for what you did with other people's money." I told them the dossier on the table was not the only copy. The previous morning, an encrypted version had been delivered to the Federal Fraud Division, the SEC Enforcement Intake Office, and counsel for Connor's investors. The bank's fraud department had received the forged guarantee at the same time. Alexander retained the transmission receipts. Deleting files, changing ledgers, or moving money would only create new evidence of obstruction. Caldwell's face went slack. He closed his laptop as though shutting the screen could reverse what he had heard. Howard stared at the dossier, calculating who might talk first. Connor gripped the edge of the table, his shoulders shaking. For once, my parents could not purchase his escape. Whitney demanded to know whether her jewelry and personal accounts were exposed. I told her the necklace around her neck had been charged to a corporate card 2 days after Connor received restricted investor funds. Investigators would determine whether she knew the source. Either way, she should return it before it was identified as an asset purchased with misappropriated capital. She reached for the clasp so quickly that one fingernail scraped her skin. "And you should pack tonight," I added. "The bank confirmed that the collateral supporting your home loan is impaired. Foreclosure counsel is filing at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Whitney stared at Connor. "You told me the house was protected." Connor whispered that he could fix it, but the words sounded automatic and empty. I left the dossier open between us. Behind Caldwell, the balance screen still showed the $42.16 they had mistaken for $4 million. In front of them sat 300 pages explaining why the money was gone, why Connor's company could not be saved, and why Howard's final attempt to protect his son had converted a family conspiracy into a federal case. No one shouted now. The evidence had removed every lie they might have hidden behind, and left each of them facing the precise consequences of his or her own choices. My father was still sitting there clutching the armrests of his executive chair. Howard watched his golden boy completely fall apart, and then he looked back at me. He realized that the anger and the threats had failed miserably. He realized that Arthur Caldwell could not save him, and that Connor was completely useless in a real crisis. So Howard desperately reached for the absolute last weapon he had left in his vast emotional arsenal. He tried to play the role of the deeply wounded, benevolent patriarch. He let out a long, ragged breath, forcing his rigid shoulders to slump deliberately, manufacturing a look of profound, heartbreaking disappointment. He looked me right in the eyes, his voice trembling with a perfectly calculated pitch of paternal sorrow. He asked me how I could possibly do this to my own blood. He pleaded with me, claiming that he was my father, the man who had raised me, provided for me, and the man who had given me life. He swept his shaking hand across the room, pointing at my weeping mother, my broken brother, and my absolutely devastated sister-in-law. He raised his voice, injecting it with a desperate, righteous indignation, pretending that he was the moral authority in the room. He accused me of being a cold, calculating, and heartless monster. He yelled that I was intentionally tearing my own flesh and blood apart over a simple, easily resolved misunderstanding about money. He screamed that I was completely destroying this family. I did not raise my voice to match his manufactured outrage. I kept my tone perfectly level, letting the absolute coldness of my words slice right through his desperate performance. I told him to stop pretending that this was a simple, innocent misunderstanding. I reminded him that he had looked a bank officer in the eye and handed over a collateral guarantee bearing a flawless, calculated forgery of my personal signature. I pointed out that he had conspired with a corrupt lawyer to draft a backdated legal document specifically designed to rob me blind the exact moment I boarded a plane to another country. I told him that those were not the actions of a loving father making a minor financial misstep under pressure. Those were the calculated, predatory actions of a common, ordinary criminal. I watched his jaw tighten, the illusion of the wounded patriarch cracking under the weight of the undeniable truth. He tried to interrupt me, opening his mouth to spin another desperate lie about protecting the family legacy, but I held up my hand and cut him off completely. I told him he did not get to speak about family legacy anymore, because his twisted version of family was nothing more than a parasitic financial arrangement designed to keep his own ego perfectly intact. It was the ultimate, undeniable truth of the entire horrific situation right now. I systematically dismantled every single lie he had used to justify his behavior for the past 3 decades. I looked him dead in the eye and recounted the endless years of emotional abuse and total neglect I had endured while living under his roof. I reminded him that I had spent my entire life being treated as nothing more than a convenient safety net and a quiet punching bag. I pointed out how my mother had sat silently by, complicit in every single manipulation, weaponizing her own manufactured guilt trips to keep me compliant, while he pulled all the strings. I told him about the nights I sat alone at my tiny kitchen table in college, eating cheap ramen noodles, and absolutely terrified of missing a rent payment, while he was busy writing massive checks to cover Connor's luxury apartments and high-end sports cars. I told him that I had built my entire career, my professional reputation, and my financial independence entirely on my own, without a single ounce of his support, encouragement, or guidance. I laid out the sheer, breathtaking entitlement it took for him to look at the security I had painstakingly built for myself and decide that it rightfully belonged to his golden son. I told him that he had spent 35 years actively cultivating Connor's arrogance, continuously funding his extreme incompetence, and systematically shielding him from every single consequence of his terrible actions. I explained that Connor was not a victim of a bad market or difficult institutional investors. Connor was a monster of my father's own deliberate creation. Howard had raised an arrogant, entitled fraud, and when that fraud finally caught up with them, my father had simply decided that my entire future was the acceptable price to pay to cover up his own colossal failure as a parent. He had viewed me as nothing more than a highly profitable insurance policy, an emergency fund waiting to be raided the moment his precious son inevitably crashed and burned. Howard sat frozen in his large leather chair. The color had completely left his face, and his eyes were wide with a stark, undeniable terror. He was not looking at a compliant daughter anymore. He was looking at a perfect mirror reflecting 33 years of his own toxic manipulative parenting right back at him. He tried to open his mouth to speak, to offer one last pathetic defense, but there was absolutely nothing left for him to say. His empire of control was completely gone, permanently shattered by the very daughter he had consistently underestimated and casually ignored. The silence in the grand conference room was absolute, broken only by the soft, pathetic sounds of my mother quietly sobbing in the chair next to him. She finally realized the depth of the ruin they had invited into their lives. I closed the thick black cover of the forensic audit dossier. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward, ensuring that he heard every single syllable of my final, unwavering verdict. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I did not destroy this family, Dad. I just audited it. You orchestrated your own destruction. I held my father's gaze for a long moment, watching the profound realization of his absolute ruin settle into the deep lines of his aging face. He had nothing left to say. The commanding patriarch who had dictated every term of my existence was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man staring at the devastating consequences of his own monumental arrogance. I did not wait for a response, nor did I want one. I slowly reached out and placed my hands on the thick black cover of the forensic audit dossier resting in the center of the mahogany table. I intentionally chose not to take it with me when I departed. I left it sitting right there, as a physical monument to their destruction. I calmly picked up my black leather briefcase, feeling the satisfying lightness of it now that the heavy burden of proof had been delivered. I turned my back on my father, my mother, my brother, and the corrupt lawyer who had tried to steal my entire future. I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the grand conference room, my heels clicking with a steady rhythmic cadence against the plush carpet. Behind me, the paralyzed silence finally broke, giving way to a chaotic symphony of pure, unadulterated panic. Connor started screaming again, his voice cracking as he yelled at Caldwell to do something, to find a legal loophole to fix the disaster that was entirely unfixable. Whitney was sobbing uncontrollably, her loud, gasping wails echoing off the soundproof walls as she finally processed the grim reality of her impending bankruptcy and massive public humiliation. My mother was weeping uncontrollably on the floor, calling out my name in a weak, pathetic plea that I completely ignored. I did not turn around. I reached out, grasped the polished brass handle of the heavy door, and pulled it open. I stepped out into the quiet, sterile reception area and let the heavy oak door click firmly shut behind me, instantly cutting off the frantic, desperate shouts of my ruined family. I walked past the reception desk without looking at the stunned receptionist who had undoubtedly heard the muffled screaming coming from the conference room. I pressed the call button for the elevator and watched the digital floor indicator light up. When the silver doors slid open, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation washed over me. It started as a subtle lightness in my chest and quickly radiated outward, loosening the tight, defensive knots I had carried in my shoulders for 33 years. For my entire life, I had operated under the suffocating weight of my family's expectations, constantly bracing myself for the next time I would be required to sacrifice my own well-being to subsidize my brother's catastrophic failures. I had spent decades playing the role of the quiet, dependable scapegoat, absorbing their casual cruelty and emotional neglect just to keep the peace. That terrible role was officially, permanently, and undeniably terminated today. I walked out of the towering glass and steel building and stepped into the crisp, cool afternoon air. I hailed a waiting black car and instructed the driver to take me directly to the international terminal at the airport. I settled into the back seat of the car, watching the city skyline blur past the tinted windows. I expected to feel a sudden wave of grief, or perhaps a lingering sense of guilt for leaving them to face the absolute destruction I had orchestrated. But as I sat there, in the quiet comfort of the moving car, I realized that I felt absolutely no sadness whatsoever. There were no tears threatening to fall, and there was no tightness in my throat. I felt nothing but a pure, crystalline clarity. I had not robbed them. I had not fabricated the evidence of Connor's massive financial fraud, and I had certainly not forged my own signature on a bank document. I had simply held up a very clear, very accurate mirror to their actions, and I was allowing them to suffer the natural, devastating consequences of the exact crimes they had committed. The guilt belonged entirely to them. I was completely free. The drive to the airport felt like transitioning between two completely different lifetimes. By the time the black car pulled up to the international departures curb, my phone had already begun to vibrate relentlessly inside my pocket. The notifications were lighting up my screen in rapid, frantic succession. It was a torrential flood of incoming text messages, missed calls, and desperate voicemails from my father and my brother. They were begging me to answer, pleading for a negotiation, and offering empty, frantic apologies that I knew were completely manufactured by their sheer terror of federal prosecution. I did not read the messages. I did not listen to the voicemails. I simply muted the device, silencing their panic with the touch of a button. I handed the driver a generous tip, grabbed my sleek overnight bag, and walked through the sliding glass doors into the bustling, brightly lit terminal. Moving through the airport felt like a well-deserved victory lap. I navigated the security checkpoints with ease, the chaotic energy of the travelers around me feeling strangely comforting. I was just another anonymous consultant heading overseas for a lucrative corporate contract, blending perfectly into the crowd of international passengers. I made my way to the exclusive first-class lounge, ordered a glass of sparkling water, and sat in a quiet corner overlooking the massive tarmac. I watched the heavy commercial airplanes taxiing across the runway, preparing to lift off and cross the ocean. I opened my briefcase one last time to verify my travel documents and my passport. Resting right next to my passport was the official confirmation letter from Alexander Vance, detailing the final, irrevocable establishment of my offshore blind trust in the Isle of Man. My inheritance was safe secured behind a fortress of international banking law, completely untouchable by domestic litigation, greedy family members, or desperate creditors. I closed the briefcase and locked the brass latches sealing my past away for good. The boarding announcement for my flight to London echoed softly through the lounge speakers. I gathered my belongings, thanked the lounge attendant, and walked purposefully toward my designated gate. As I stepped onto the jet bridge, I felt the final lingering threads of my toxic family dynamic simply snap and fall away. I handed my boarding pass to the flight attendant, receiving a warm, professional smile in return. I walked onto the plane and settled into my spacious private suite in the first-class cabin. The plush seat was incredibly comfortable, a physical representation of the luxury and security I had built entirely on my own, without a single ounce of support from the people who had tried to steal it. I settled in, fastening my seatbelt, as the flight attendants prepared the cabin for departure. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mobile phone one final time. The screen was completely filled with dozens of new unanswered notifications from my parents and Connor. They were still trapped in that downtown law office, suffocating under the crushing weight of their impending bankruptcy, federal indictments, and total social ruin. I looked at the screen for a few seconds, feeling a deep, satisfying closure. I pressed the power button, held it down, and swiped across the screen to shut the device off completely. The screen went pitch black, cutting the last remaining digital tie to my family. The heavy jet engines roared to life, a deep, powerful vibration that signaled the start of a brand new chapter. The plane taxied down the runway, gathered speed, and lifted smoothly into the sky. As the city disappeared beneath the clouds, I realized that the scared, compliant daughter they thought they knew was permanently left behind on the tarmac. The woman flying across the Atlantic Ocean was entirely new, completely independent, and absolutely untouchable. Exactly 3 months have passed since my flight lifted off the tarmac and carried me away from the wreckage of my former life. Settling into London was not just a geographic relocation. It was a complete and total rebirth. I stepped into my new role as a lead forensic consultant for a premier European firm without missing a single beat. The transition was incredibly smooth, mostly because my mind was finally clear of the constant, exhausting background noise of my family's endless demands. Without the heavy burden of managing their manufactured crises, I poured all my energy into my work leading major international corporate restructuring deals across the continent. I was flying to Paris one week and Frankfurt the next, dismantling complex financial fraud for multinational corporations and securing assets with the exact same ruthless efficiency I had used to protect my own inheritance. My career was thriving beyond my wildest expectations, but the professional success was entirely secondary to the profound sense of peace that had finally settled into my bones. For the first time in my 33 years, my apartment was quiet. My evenings were my own. I did not jump every time my phone buzzed, anticipating another fabricated emergency or a manipulative guilt trip. I was completely financially independent, my offshore trust quietly compounding interest safely out of reach, and I was living a life entirely on my own terms. The toxic dynamic that had defined my existence felt like a distant, faded nightmare that belonged to a completely different person. It was a crisp, beautifully clear Saturday morning in late February. I was standing on the private balcony of my new apartment, which offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the River Thames. The cold London air was refreshing, a sharp contrast to the steaming mug of dark roast coffee I held in my hands. I watched the boats slowly navigating the dark water, feeling a deep, abiding contentment. I had purchased a new mobile phone the day I landed in the United Kingdom, leaving my old domestic number permanently disconnected. Only a very select few people had my new international contact information, primarily my colleagues, my private wealth manager, and Alexander Vance, the ruthless trust attorney who had helped me secure my freedom. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the peaceful quiet of the morning, when my phone vibrated gently against the metal patio table. I picked up the device and looked at the screen. I had received a new encrypted digital voicemail forwarded through the secure legal portal Alexander had set up for me. He had established a screening protocol specifically designed to catch any desperate legal communications from my father, ensuring they were routed through his office before reaching me. I unlocked my phone and tapped the play button, lifting the device to my ear. I expected to hear Alexander's dry, professional voice giving me a routine update on the frozen domestic accounts. Instead, the frantic, hysterical sound of my mother's voice shattered the calm London morning. Barbara was sobbing so hard that her words were initially difficult to understand. She was speaking in rapid, breathless gasps, completely abandoning the polished, perfectly composed, suburban matriarch persona she had maintained for decades. She cried out my name, begging me to pick up the phone, pleading with me to call her back. She sounded entirely broken, like a woman who had just watched her entire universe collapse into dust. I did not feel a single ounce of panic as I listened to her wail. I simply leaned back against the iron railing of my balcony, took another calm sip of my coffee, and let her frantic voicemail paint a vivid picture of the absolute ruin they had brought upon themselves. My mother hysterically revealed the full, devastating extent of the fallout. She sobbed as she explained that the federal authorities had not ignored the comprehensive forensic dossier I had forwarded to them. Exactly 1 week after I left the country, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had showed up at Howard's corporate office and Connor's luxury real estate headquarters simultaneously. They had seized hard drives, confiscated physical files, and frozen every single remaining business account tied to their names. Barbara wept as she confessed that both my father and my brother were currently facing massive multi-count federal indictments for wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. The sheer volume of evidence I had provided made it completely impossible for Arthur Caldwell to spin a defense. In fact, she wailed, that Caldwell had already flipped on them, cutting a plea deal with the prosecutors to save himself from a maximum sentence. He had surrendered all of his communication records, definitively proving that Howard had orchestrated the forged power of attorney. The destruction did not stop at criminal charges. Barbara choked on her tears as she described the utter demolition of Connor's personal life. The morning after the bank realized the collateral guarantee was a complete forgery, they moved forward with the immediate foreclosure of his highly mortgaged home. The moment the bank seized their assets and the reality of Connor's massive fraud became public knowledge, Whitney did exactly what I knew she would do. She did not stand by her husband in his darkest hour. Instead, she immediately packed her bags, moved back in with her parents, and filed for a highly publicized, incredibly messy divorce. She was actively cooperating with the federal investigators, eager to distance herself from the sinking ship and legally protect whatever personal assets she had left. She had completely abandoned the golden child the second his gold turned out to be counterfeit. Connor was currently living in my parents' guest room, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending incarceration. My mother's voice grew even more frantic, hitting a pitch of pure desperation. She cried about the absolute obliteration of the family's social standing in our hometown. The local news outlets had gotten a hold of the federal indictments, and the scandal had been splashed across the front pages of every financial publication in the city. The country club had quietly revoked their membership. Their wealthy friends had completely stopped returning their calls, treating them like toxic pariahs. Barbara sobbed that she could not even show her face at the grocery store without people staring and whispering about the family who had tried to rob their own daughter to cover up a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. They had lost their reputation, their money, their freedom, and their pride. The voicemail ended with a pathetic, agonizing plea. Barbara begged me to access my offshore trust and wire them the money to pay for a high-powered federal defense attorney. She claimed that Howard was facing decades in federal prison and that Connor was completely suicidal over the loss of his business, his marriage, and his impending jail sentence. She begged me to show them mercy, to remember that we were family, and to bail them out of the living nightmare they were currently enduring. She swore that things would be different, that they would respect me, and that they would never ask for anything ever again if I just saved them this one last time. The audio message abruptly cut off, leaving me standing in the crisp London air. I lowered the phone from my ear and looked out over the River Thames, watching the morning sunlight catch the ripples on the water. I processed the sheer magnitude of their destruction, realizing that every single consequence they were facing was a direct result of their own unmitigated greed. They had tried to destroy my future, and the recoil had completely annihilated theirs. I stood completely still, breathing in the fresh air, letting the reality of my absolute victory wash over me. The trap they built had clamped shut, breaking their own bones while I remained untouched. I looked down at the glowing screen of my mobile device. The audio playback bar had reached the very end of Barbara's frantic, desperate voicemail. The automated voice prompt from my secure legal portal politely asked if I wanted to save the message forwarded to my attorney or delete it permanently. In the past, the younger, deeply conditioned version of myself would have saved that message. I would have listened to it a dozen times, agonizing over the manufactured guilt, wondering if there was some compromise I could offer to ease their suffering while still protecting myself. I would have drafted a dozen different text messages trying to explain my actions to people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. But that woman no longer existed. She had been completely liquidated the moment I walked out of Arthur Caldwell's downtown law office 3 months ago. I did not feel a single ounce of obligation toward the weeping woman on the other end of that recording. I did not owe them a financial bailout, and I certainly did not owe them my emotional labor. I raised my thumb and hovered it directly over the digital trash can icon on the screen. I pressed down with a soft, definitive tap. The screen flashed briefly, instantly erasing the audio file from the secure server. I did not stop there. I navigated to the contact settings in my phone, selected the blocked numbers list, and permanently added my mother's contact information to the firewall Alexander Vance had built for me. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Connor's number. I systematically went through and severed every remaining digital thread that could possibly connect me back to the suburban nightmare I had escaped. I placed the phone face down on the small metal patio table, picked up my ceramic coffee mug, and took a long, slow sip of the dark roast. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. I turned my attention back to the sweeping view of the River Thames. The morning commuters were beginning to fill the walking paths below my balcony, bundled in heavy wool coats and moving with quiet, determined purpose. I watched them navigate the city, feeling a profound sense of kinship with my new surroundings. London was a city built on centuries of resilience, a place that had been knocked down and rebuilt stronger time and time again. It was exactly where I needed to be to construct my own unshakable foundation. As I stood there in the crisp air, I allowed myself to fully process the magnitude of the justice I had achieved. For 33 years, I had believed that standing up for myself meant engaging in endless, exhausting arguments. I had thought that justice required a dramatic reconciliation, a cinematic moment where my parents would finally look at me, recognize my inherent worth, and offer a tearful, genuine apology for a lifetime of systemic abuse. I had wasted so much energy hoping they would suddenly become the family I deserved. But true justice did not look like an apology from Howard or Barbara. True justice looked exactly like this quiet balcony on a Saturday morning. It came from the absolute, unwavering commitment to standing firmly in my own truth, regardless of the chaotic tantrums erupting around me. I had not destroyed my father, and I had not ruined my brother. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed the natural, devastating consequences of their own actions to finally consume them. They had spent decades believing they were entirely above the law, insulated by their wealth and protected by the convenient scapegoat they had molded me to be. When I removed myself from that toxic equation, Their entire house of cards instantly collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. They were currently suffocating under federal indictments and public humiliation. Not because I was a vindictive daughter, but because they were fundamentally corrupt people who had finally run out of other people's money to steal. I finished the last drop of my coffee, feeling the comforting warmth settle deep into my chest. I turned my back on the river and stepped inside my spacious, brightly lit apartment. The walls were decorated with art I had chosen myself, and the furniture was arranged exactly the way I wanted it. There were no traces of the stifling, oppressive expectations that had suffocated me in Chicago. I walked into my home office and sat down at my massive wooden desk, booting up my encrypted workstation to prepare for the upcoming week of international client meetings. I loved my job. I loved the meticulous, complex puzzle of analyzing corporate structures, identifying toxic assets, and removing the rot so that a healthy, sustainable entity could emerge from the wreckage. As I opened my financial auditing software, I caught my reflection in the dark monitor screen before it fully illuminated. The woman looking back at me was strong, fiercely independent, and absolutely untouchable. I realized then that my professional skills were not just reserved for wealthy corporate clients facing hostile takeovers. The rigorous logic of forensic restructuring applied perfectly to the messy, complicated reality of human relationships. We are taught from a very young age that blood is thicker than water, and that family is an unbreakable bond that must be preserved at all costs. But that is a dangerous, manipulative lie designed to keep victims chained to their abusers. Sometimes the people who share your last name are simply terrible investments. They drain your emotional reserves, bankrupt your self-esteem, and deliberately leverage your future to subsidize their own catastrophic failures. I learned the hard way that you cannot fix a fundamentally corrupt system by endlessly pouring your own valuable resources into a bottomless pit of entitlement. You cannot save people who are actively trying to destroy you. Sometimes the most necessary, life-saving restructuring you will ever do is looking objectively at your own life, identifying the toxic people dragging you down, and mercilessly liquidating them from your daily operations. You have to be willing to cut your losses, freeze the accounts, and walk away without a single glance backward. I audited my family. I secured my independence, and I built a brilliant, untouchable future entirely on my own terms. And I have absolutely no regrets whatsoever. Looking back, the lesson was simpler than the financial structure that exposed them. Blood does not create a right to someone else's future. My parents called exploitation sacrifice because that language kept me obedient. Once I stopped debating their version of family and protected myself instead, their control disappeared. I did not win because they apologized or finally understood me. I won because I accepted that they might never change and acted accordingly. My inheritance remained secure, my work belonged to me, and the life waiting outside their crisis was larger than anything they had allowed me to imagine. If you have ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace, independence, or future from toxic relatives, share what helped you take that step in the comments. If Nina's story resonated with you, like the video and subscribe for more stories about surviving betrayal, reclaiming control, and building a life no one else can raid. Thank you for listening. Your first responsibility is not to preserve a destructive family system. It is to protect the person you still have the power to save, yourself.